Welcome to the motherfucking relay. We're covering today's top boxing news.
Okay, we'll start with this. Naoya Inoue has publicly told Junto Nakatani that he must first beat his brother Takuma Inoue in a WBA, WBC, Bantamweight World Title Unification fight before he can think about moving up and challenging him for the undisputed at Super Bantamweight. What do I think? Some people may not like the idea that one fighter is making stipulations to another for a fight, that you've got to do X, Y, and Z before you can fight with me. Some people don't like that. Myself, I don't mind it because I feel like that needs to happen anyway. In a very general sense, away from a Naoya Inoue fight, Takuma Inoue is a champion at the same weight as Junto, and Bantamweight needs unifications since there are currently 4 champions there. Junto and Takuma, I'd say, are the number 1 and number 2 guys there. Junto Nakatani sports an unblemished record of 28 wins with no losses, no draws, 21 knockouts. A 3-division champion. To Takuma Inoue, who sports a professional record of 20 wins with 1 loss, no draws, 5 knockouts, having never been knocked out in 5 professional bouts. He's not necessarily the powerhouse that his older brother is, Naoya Inoue, but Takuma is a very skilled boxer. Emphasis on boxer in his boxing. If Junto Nakatani wasn't there, I think Takuma would have the run of the place, and I would give him very good odds to beat the other 2 champions. They're not as experienced as he is. Takuma is set to return to action next month as part of a boxing festival of sorts. Takuma's going to be fighting, Junto is going to be fighting in defense of their bantamweight titles. It's a 2-day festival over there in Japan. 2 cards. Takuma is set to be defending his title on the 13th. Then Junto will be defending his title on the 14th. They both make it through those fights. The question is, when will they fight? Because the story is that Junto Nakatani and Naoya Inoue are set to fight on the same show at some point next year, and that could be here in America. Point of contention. If Naoya has now made it a requisite for Junto that he has to fight his brother first, well, you wouldn't do a fight between Junto and Takuma in America. You'd be leaving a lot of money on the table that you could be making in Japan. It doesn't make sense to do that here. Being completely honest with you, it doesn't make sense for Junto or Naoya or Takuma to have to involve an American audience into their affairs in any way when they already have an established audience in Japan that would love to watch them. So I don't really know how this breaks down, because the story up until this point has been that beyond this year, next year, Junto and Naoya would fight on the same show. That's what they were saying immediately after Naoya Inoue's fight with TJ Doheny. They were going to try to put both those boys on the same card, and that card might land here in America. Well, you don't waste Junto versus Takuma on an undercard. You don't waste Junto versus Takuma on the Americans. It doesn't mean to the Americans what it would mean to the Japanese. It's not going to elicit the same level of fanfare, since Americans don't watch bantamweights and super bantamweights as much as the Japanese. If this is what the requisite is now, you don't waste that fight on the Americans. You don't waste Junto versus Takuma, since that's build-up for Junto versus Naoya. You may be thinking to yourself, well, what do these Japanese guys need from Top Rank then? What do they need from Top Rank? What do they need from ESPN? By being in bed with Top Rank and ESPN, it gives their fights a home here in America, a broadcast partner where me and you can watch them. But that's it. That's all. Beyond that, I don't think that Junto or Takuma or Naoya actually need anything from Top Rank and ESPN besides that, a U.S. broadcast partner in America. That's it. When do they do the fight between Junto and Takuma? Will that be Junto's first fight of next year? And how many times will he fight next year before he faces Inoue? Naoya Inoue at 122. 1 time? 2 times? Before moving up, before facing Naoya Inoue, how many times next year is Junto gonna fight? As far as the fight with Takuma, I would give Junto reasonable odds to beat Takuma. I think Junto is the best in show at 118 pounds, and I would give him very good odds to beat the other 3 champions at this weight. If he made it his mission to become that division's undisputed champion, I think that mission would be successful. He'd be successful in that campaign, though I don't know necessarily that that's what he wants to do. Does he want all the belts, or is he just focused on Takuma so he can get to Naoya? 2-3 fight plan that caps off the following year with Junto moving up and taking on Naoya. And while Junto's doing all of that, what is Naoya doing? Who is Naoya fighting? Since he already took care of all the champions at 122, who does that leave him with? He's gonna fight Sam Goodman later on this year, one of his mandatory challenges. He has another in MJ Akhmadaliev, former champion MJ Akhmadaliev. He could always bring that guy to Japan. He could always fight him next year, bring him to Japan. That, even though Top Rank and Matchroom don't have the best working relationship, it's not like Top Rank is at the helm of promotion for Inoue anyway. They're just along for the ride. Inoue's primary handler is Mr. Ohashi. I feel like Top Rank has to fall in line with whatever Inoue and Ohashi decide. And if what they're doing now is building up a Junto Nakatani fight, you don't actually need to come to America to do anything. The fight's gonna be in Japan anyway. What would be the point? What would be the point in bringing Junto to America or Inoue to America if the showdown between them is going to be in Japan? I don't get it. It's almost like the Americans are begging the Japanese to pander to them, to cater to them, when they really don't have to. Let's talk about how much bigger a superstar Inoue would be if he based himself out of America. He's doing just fine over there. And frankly, I don't see enough Americans supporting American fighters, homegrown fighters here, that a foreign fighter needs to focus on us. It's stupid. For me and my money, I would be perfectly content with both Junto and Inoue staying over there, catering to the audience that is already established, is already built in Japan. I personally like my early morning boxing and breakfast. I love it. Here and now, from the horse's mouth. The intent seems to be putting Junto in the ring with Naoya. That's the focus? I love everything about that fight, though I do think it's too soon to call it. We've got to see how Junto looks in his next fight and the one after that, which could presumably be the one with Takuma. Takuma's a pretty good boxer. Junto beats him. If Junto has 2 fights next year before facing Inoue, let one of those fights be the fight with Takuma, and let one of those fights be the fight with Luis Neri at 122. I think that would be ideal. I think that's the one fight you could bring Junto to America for. You can bring him here for that one. And Inoue? I don't see any reason to bring Naoya Inoue to America. For what? For an MJ Akhmadaliev fight at 122? It wouldn't make sense. In men's lightweight and super lightweight news, newly crowned WBA champion Jose Rayo Valenzuela's trainer Robert Garcia has shut down claims that Rayo could be fighting Gervonta Davis next. Why? Could be the weight. If they were going to fight, where would they have fought? Would Rayo have had to move down for 135 to fight for Gervonta's title? Or was Gervonta going to move up for his? Fighting at 140 as opposed to 135, that's gotta be a breath of fresh air for Rayo, not having to cut that extra 5 pounds. Though it's conceivable that if Gervonta were the one moving up, he'd put weight stipulations on the fight. He'd likely put a rehydration cap in there on Rayo. So maybe that's why. Maybe the weight. Maybe the schedule, that they just fought in August and they want to enjoy their time as champion, their time with the WBA title. They don't want to work on a tight schedule. Maybe it's that. The last week or so, I saw 2 names attached to a potential Gervonta Davis fight. One was Rayo's name, and the other was Lamont Roach, WBA super featherweight champion Lamont Roach. They share a common opponent in Hector Luis Garcia, former WBA super featherweight champion Hector Garcia. Gervonta fought him early last year, but that was at lightweight, not super feather, where he held the WBA title. So Gervonta stops him at 135 pounds. He moves back down. He fights Lamont Roach and loses a split decision, loses the WBA title. Lamont takes it over to Pro Box, successfully defends it for the first time. So here we are. Commercially, I don't think a Lamont Roach fight would do all that well. I don't. Now, both Lamont and Gervonta are from Baltimore, Maryland. They both are. And I don't know, maybe this would be a big fight if you live in a DMV, but for the rest of the country and the rest of the boxing sphere, this is not a big fight. And if you didn't do great numbers with Frank Martin, you're not going to do better numbers with Lamont Roach. But that's what I heard earlier this week, that they were looking at either a Rayo Valenzuela fight or a Lamont Roach fight. Now that Rayo is out, at least according to Robert, that leaves Lamont. Slim pickings for Gervonta. Didn't really have to be the most seasoned analyst or the most seasoned boxing fan to know that Gervonta Davis moving forward would struggle to do the numbers he did with Ryan Garcia last year. There were not a lot of fights like that. The most rewards for the least risks, because that's what that was. Ryan was not a risky fight for Gervonta, and nobody thought he was. Not the odds makers, not the bookies, not many of the fans. As much as I don't like Gervonta Davis, I still picked him to win the fight. I still picked him to knock Ryan out, and he did. But there were not a lot of other fights like that. That would get you the most rewards for the least risks. I ain't got nothing against Lamont Roach. Credit to him for becoming a champion, but I wouldn't call that a risky fight for Gervonta, would you? It's not a risky fight. So while it's not a risky fight, it's not all that rewarding a fight either, where you're going to do big numbers with this thing. You're not. Nope. I also heard talk of a Rayo Valenzuela versus Isaac Cruz rematch for the coming year. I heard talk about that they might revisit that fight. They might run it back. Rayo has to be very careful now, because fighting the same fight that he fought, fighting the fight that won him the fight at Riyadh season, would lose him the fight at the PBC. Oh, that's right, that's right. I think if that fight would have happened at the PBC's more invested in Isaac, so the decision would have went to Isaac. If you run it back with him now, if you run it back at the PBC, they might try to jerk you. Better think about that. Think it over. Unbeaten up-and-comer from Japan, Andy Hirioka, stopped Ishmael Barroso in 9 rounds. That's not getting talked about. He took that guy's mandatory position. He's in line to fight Rayo. And he has money behind him. It's a dangerous fight, too. And Andy's strong. Andy can punch. He wore out Ishmael Barroso. Called out Rayo Valenzuela after the fight on the undercard of Inoue versus Doheny. So it's kind of slim pickings for Rayo, too? You could lose. You could lose to Andy. But you could lose to Isaac running it back. On the PBC side of things, you might. You say you're not cashing out with Gervonta Davis, but if you don't, there were still other guys waiting in the queue, waiting to get at you.
Sometimes you being a fighter just like Devin Haney. Let me give you an example. Devin Haney, he wanted those belts from Kambosos. What did he do? He took short money. He went overseas, not once, but twice to receive that money. That short money, but to get those belts. So if Boots really wanted this fight, it wasn't Eddie Hearns who had to give extra money. It was Boots who should have said, all right, you want the extra $500,000? I want that title. Here you go. Go ahead and take a little bit of my cut. I'll take a gamble because I believe I'm going to knock you out or beat you, and the fight's going to get made.
It's not a bad suggestion from Tim Bradley. It's not a bad shout, given the circumstances, what the alternative is. Either fighting Karen Chukadzian again on foreign soil, which no one wants to see anyway, or vacating the title and having to move up. This is not a bad shout. But what I don't like about it is that so much of the onus is placed on Jaron Ennis and none of it is placed on Brian Norman, that Brian Norman's bargaining power seems to be he doesn't want this fight as bad as Jaron Ennis.
Is that it?
And that gives him power. You have to convince him. You have to persuade him. Because offering him 17 times his highest purse, that's not enough, because Matchroom doing what they can to make the fight as opposed to Top Rank doing absolutely nothing.
Top Rank never offered to pay for this fight. They never offered to bring over Jaron Ennis. If you're worth what you think you're worth, then why isn't your own promoter backing you?
And it's because he's not. It's because in reality, the only bargaining power you have is that you're willing to walk away from the table, but Brian Norman shouldn't be celebrated for that. He should be chastised, lambasted, that you should want this fight as much as Jaron Ennis, because you don't even make what Jaron Ennis makes per fight. You're not there yet.
You may never get there.
In boxing, and especially on that side of the street, at Top Rank, where anything can happen, you're playing Russian roulette. The problem I have with Tim's suggestion is that it's structured in such a way where all the responsibility is on one side to see the fight done, that all the sacrifice has to come from one side to see the fight done, but not the other.
Why? Because the other doesn't want it? That's what you're not saying.
That the Normans don't really want this fight, and they never did, that they're holding it to ransom, making this extortion. It's extortion. It's not making a fight.
If you endorse this argument, you then have to acknowledge that the Normans don't really want it.
You expect Jaren Ennis to sacrifice so much. He's supposed to have all the energy to do everything to ensure it happens, and Brian has to do what? Brian has to do nothing. Just make his demands and expect Boots to meet them. You have to acknowledge the Normans don't want it as bad as Team Ennis, and once you acknowledge that the Normans didn't really want it,
Why don't you want the fight?
you don't want the fight. Not when your alternative is being a decorative item for an unbeaten prospect. A prospect. You are a champion. Ideally, you would be headlining your own show. You're not.
And you're actually okay with that. If you endorse Tim's argument, I guess that you would have to be okay with that too. That he's fighting on an undercard where he could be in a main event.
That's his alternative. A fight that we as boxing fans don't care for, don't want. Who in God's green earth was asking Brian Norman to fight Derek Cuevas? Who was asking Jaren Ennis to fight Karen Chukadzian again? For you to endorse Tim's argument that Jaren Ennis should have done more,
You'd be inadvertently giving Brian Norman a pass for not wanting the fight, not wanting it as bad as Jaren Ennis.
because where's the opposing view? The view where Brian should have been more willing to take the fight. Brian should have wanted it as bad as the other guys. He didn't. And underneath it all, everybody knows he didn't. So why should he get a pass for it?
I ain't giving him one.
He's scared to lose. That's what needs to be said because that's what it is.
So when the boxing fans and the people within boxing, the media, don't just call a spade and call it what it is, more and more fighters feel empowered, emboldened to behave in just this fashion. Like when a Luis Ortiz claims he's being lowballed by Matchroom, by Eddie Hearn. They offered you $5 or $6 million to fight Anthony Joshua for 3 alphabet titles.
A guy you wouldn't shut the fuck up about. A guy you claimed was a pussy. A guy you claimed you wanted to fight so bad. Like the Normans were claiming they wanted to fight Boots so bad. Just so that when push comes to shove, you bulk. And people don't hold you accountable.
American boxing culture has become synonymous with duck culture, duck talk, behind the guise of business.
Co-opting business jargon in a veiled effort to disguise your fear, your risk-averse management, because that's all it is.
The numbers gotta make sense.
Makes sense for who? Makes sense for you. Just you.
Because it doesn't make sense for Matchroom to continue to overpay you when they already offered to overpay you by 17 times.
And on top of that, the suggestion now is they should have offered up even more. $500,000 more. What were the Normans offering up? What was their play? What was their offer?
Nothing, because they didn't want it.
One side wanted it, and they tried to make it, and one side didn't. That's the situation. That's what happened.
And for that, I'm not giving Brian Norman a pass.
You should want it just as much, if not more, than Jaren Ennis, because you don't even make what Jaren Ennis makes. You don't make anything.
You're a prize fighter, aren't you? They offered a bigger prize than the one you're about to fight for.